Greetings, I am Mr. O'Neill and I teach English language arts online for Stride K12, and I also coach chess as well as a few other esports for Stride K12. We have arrived at the end of the winter season for the K12 Esports League Chess Club, and let's take a look at how the championship matches went down for the blue bracket and for the teal bracket. Beginning with the blue bracket, I Rookrolled You and Dr. Evilman 12 went head-to-head for the championship match. Analyzing the all-time head-to-head record between the two, I Rookrolled You held the advantage. 549 wins to 58 draws and 333 losses versus Dr. Evilman 12. So Dr. Evilman 12 was the underdog here, but they had definitely won their fair share of matches against I Rookrolled You over the years, and they were not to be counted out based on those results, and we'll analyze the match in a bit. In the teal bracket, Kingsaki XXIV and Heston went head-to-head for their championship match, and they had actually never played one another. I checked the chess.com statistics and game archive. They had never played one another going into the match. So it was interesting to see those two opponents face head-to-head for the very first time in the championship match for the teal bracket, which ended up being a very, very interesting match. And we'll take a look at it. In game one, we have I Rookrolled You with a Queen's opening, a London system, and also a Jobava London system, to be more specific, which is interesting because usually in this system you want the knight on d2 and you want your pawn on c3, and the point of having your pawn on c3 is it helps defend against the bishop coming to b4, and it helps defend against the queen coming to a5. And the bishop on b4 and the queen on a5 creates a battery on this dark diagonal against the king, and it can be a little uncomfortable, but this is a book move, and I Rookrolled You says, I'm not worried about my knight being on c3, and let's go for the Jobava London system. And meanwhile, Dr. Evilman 12 is perfectly happy with a King's Indian, and this King's Indian setup tells I Rookrolled You that they're probably going to castle kingside. So we have a move h4 right off the bat, which is a book move because the idea is let's get this pawn storm started on the king side to attack this potentially kingside castle. And Dr. Evilman 12 responds with a book move of h5, just blocking any further incursions by this h4 pawn. And developing the knight, castles, and then continuing to work this kingside as much as possible. Remember, Dr. Evilman 12 has to do the best they can defending the kingside, and I Rookrolled You is going to do everything they can to attack the kingside. So we have takes, and then Dr. Evilman 12 says, okay, we're not going to allow I Rookrolled You to just play the whole game on the king side and attack my king. Let's get some initiative going with attacking the queen side, given that I Rookrolled You is probably going to want to castle queen side. And that's exactly what happens. I Rookrolled You castles queen side. And Dr. Evilman 12 says, okay, perfect. Now I get to attack your king with my own pawn storm. And with correct play, it's still very even 50-50 for the most part. I mean, maybe white is slightly for choice according to the engine, plus 0.7, but it's not so simple because neither player really has a clear advantage here with correct play. So we have takes, which are best moves, and then I Rookrolled You wants to continue the pawn storm on the king side, naturally. And then normally a lot of players would want to retake this pawn and think about material, but the issue with retaking the pawn is you're creating a semi-open f-file, but the semi-open f-file doesn't really help you that much. You want an open h-file or an open g-file. These files here are the files that you want to open, the h-file and the g-file, to really attack that king. A semi-open f-file doesn't really help you that much. So they don't take, I Rookrolled You instead tries to push to really open up this h-file. And Dr. Evilman 12 completely ignores it. The correct move here is to just push the pawn to close down the file. So I rook rolled you is slightly for choice here, plus 1.4 according to the engine. You'll notice that Dr. Evenman 12 is actually winning by a point, winning by a full pawn, but the position favors I rook rolled you because of all of this initiative on the king side with this king side attack. So this is the best way to respond. Close down the H file and the G file by just pushing your G pawn to G5. And then even if there's check, of course you can't go to H7 because the bishop is covering H7, so you have to move your king back. That's the only winning move. And then it's going to be difficult for I rook rolled you to get this pawn all the way pushed because this king is acting as a nice blockade against the pawn advancing all the way to the end for a pawn promotion, and it's going to be really challenging with correct play from both sides to have a clear advantage. You can see the engine is basically 50-50 here. So what happens in the game is Dr. Evenman 12 does not close down the position with G5 like they should. They go E5 to try to open up the center. And then we have takes, which is very natural, and it's the only winning move, exclamation point, because you're opening up the H file to really go after Black's king. Versus if you were to just check, then this is the 50-50 position that we had talked about earlier. In fact, Dr. Evenman 12 might even be slightly for choice here because they're still up a pawn. And then the king can go to H7 because the bishop's not covering H7 anymore because the pawn is blocking the bishop's vision on H7. So we have takes and then takes, and then now this is a very, very difficult move to find in the game. So it really speaks to how good I rook rolled you is to find this move. I probably would not have found this move, and I'm not sure how many other players would have found this move either. But E4. And the point of E4 is it looks complicated because you've got all of this tension in the center with all these pawns staring at each other, but you're opening up your queen to deliver a nasty check on H6. So like let's say the rook slides over to H8 to try to defend against that nasty check, then you still have takes, and then this other, now the F file is completely open, and look how this king is getting exposed. And now the white just won their pawn back, and the king is very exposed on the F file and the H file, and white has a pretty clear advantage here. Plus, almost +3 according to the engine. So what ends up happening in the game is takes, like we had talked about, and then takes, and then the knight's going to move out of the way because the pawn was attacking the knight, which is an inaccuracy. It's interesting because if you take a look at the really fancy engine line, the engine likes takes, and then don't worry about the knight, sacrifice the bishop. This is a brilliant move, and this was not played in the game, but it's a very fancy engine line. And the point is that Black is stuck having to choose between taking the bishop or taking the knight. And you're really, really vulnerable on D4 here, because if you take the bishop, for example, then you're taking this pawn with check, only winning move. Black is going to defend with the knight, but then you can remove the knight this way, and the king has to move out of the way because the knight pinned itself, and then after the king moves out of the way, then you've got takes, and you're winning by, you got your minor piece back that you had lost earlier, and then you're threatening to take this. You've got a double attack here. This pawn is a passed pawn, which is eventually going to be supported by the rook. And then this is very weak because the knight is staring at this b5 pawn. And then, like I said, you've got a double attack between the pawn and the queen. Actually, a triple attack if you count the rook on this pawn. So, and then if you can get a hold of this pawn, you're looking at a potential forking the king and the rook. So this is really big problems for Dr. Evenman 12, and it's plus 0.5 according to the plus 5.2 according to the engine. So even though it's only plus even though it's only +1 in terms of material, it's +5 in reality because of how crushing this position is in white's favor. And then the other problem is, okay, you don't want to go into that line because you know you're just going to get crushed. So instead of taking the bishop, let's take the knight. Well, you end up with the same problem because the queen's going to take and get in this diagonal anyway. And now the knight has to move, and then you're running into all the same problems that you were in the other line. So it's just a giant mess for black in this position. So really interesting engine line that was not played in the game, but could have been played. And after the pawn pushes to e4 to threaten queen to h6, we do see rook to h8 to defend against the queen infiltration. So takes, the knight moves out of the way to, and also creates an attack against this pawn and moves out of the way of the attack. So the knight's going to hop into the game to keep an eye on this pawn and maybe keep an eye on this pawn. So push the pawn to try to open up the position more on the king side, and then the engine wanted black to take the pawn because the pawn was undefended, but instead the knight hops in to try to create some kind of blockade so the bishop doesn't have as much vision this way. But then we have takes, and then here the engine really likes pawn pushing to e6, which is really hard to find in the game. Instead, what we had is knight to f5 check. And this is technically an inaccuracy because in this position, if you just push the pawn, then it's a brilliant move. But then you've got takes, and then rook takes on h8 check, and then the king wants to take, but then you're getting checked again by the queen, and this is mate in 3. So you don't want to have checkmate in 3 moves. So maybe you take with the queen instead, and then now you're taking this way, and you're running it into all the same problems on this nasty diagonal that we had discovered earlier. So then the problem with putting your king here or here is then you're getting the royal pin. The royal pin, rook's pinning the king against the queen, so you're going to lose your queen. And then the other issue is if you say you don't want the royal pin, say you just put your, say you just go back this way, then you're getting checked this way, and then the king has to move again, and then you're getting checked this way. The king has to go move again, and then you're getting checked this way. And now that's another royal pin. So lots of ways to get royal pinned, but even more than a royal pin, that's just checkmate. Lots of ways for black to go wrong here. And I rickrolled you didn't actually find that brilliant move in the game, because the whole point, again, of putting your pawn on e6 is you're wanting to open up this dark square diagonal. So if you can open up the dark squares on this dark diagonal, then that's only going to help you with your big attack against the king and those lines that we had looked at. So what ends up happening in the game is takes, check, takes, which is the best move. Now, it's not a crushing position. This is only +3 for white. And I rook-rolled you, finds the best move, queen to f4. And the point of queen to f4 is your rook has a discovered attack against the queen. And you also still have an attack against the bishop with your pawn. So you're threatening to win your minor piece back. Dr. Evenman 12 is winning by a minor piece. They're winning by 3 points, but white's going to win it back because the pawn's attacking the bishop and the queen's under attack. So you're going to lose something. So takes, which is the best move, takes. The bishop moves back because you don't want to lose your minor piece. But then we have queen to h6 eventually anyway, which Dr. Evenman 12 was trying to prevent queen to h6, and we end up getting queen to h6 anyway. And then the king has to move, check again. Now you're losing your bishop. Now this is checkmate in 5 from this point. Now you might be wondering, okay, why did Dr. Evenman 12 sacrifice their bishop? Well, this is the best move after all. And the point is, if you try to move your king to safety like this, then you're getting queen to g7 check. And then let's say you try to block with the bishop. Then you have queen to f7 checkmate. So that's why they didn't go into that line, because you're going to end up losing your bishop no matter what. Check. You kind of have to block with the bishop. Otherwise, you're just getting checkmated. So maybe you want to put your king back on e8 instead of e7. You're still going to get queen to g6 check, and then the king has to run. And then you're still getting rook to d1 check. And then you want to, I mean, you could try to block with the bishop, but then you're just losing your bishop. And then that you get a royal pin, and now you're losing your queen. So you're just losing no matter where you go. You're just losing. This is checkmate 9. It's just the position's falling apart. You don't even have to take the queen right away with the rook. You can go check like this, and then you pick up the queen and get checkmate eventually anyway. So just no matter how you slice it, there's no way to save the bishop, is basically what I'm getting at here. You're going to lose the bishop, and it's checkmate. What happens in the game is h6, you lose the bishop, check, check, checkmate. That's how the game ends. So I rook rolled you gets game 1. And Dr. Evenman 12 has to win game 2 in order to even the series. In game 2, Dr. Evenman 12 has the white pieces, and they have to win to even the series 1-1. And we have a Queen's opening, London system, Jobava London system. Look familiar? Dr. Evenman 12 said, okay, I rook rolled you. You beat me in game 1 with the Jobava London system. Now I'm going to play the Jobava London system, and I'm going to beat you with it. So let's see what happens. We have a couple of more book moves, and the bishop is putting pressure on the knight right off the bat. And the correct way to play this, if you're white, is to actually put your knight on e2, because if the bishop takes the knight, then you're just going to retake with the knight and keep your pawn structure intact on the queen side. If you don't play like this and you retake with your b pawn on c3, then now you have doubled pawns on the c file, and you also have an isolated a pawn. So the issue is that that's exactly what happens in the game. And I rook rolled you responds with pawn to c5. And the point of pawn to c5 is not only are you attacking the center right off the bat, but you're also creating a threat with queen to a5. Don't forget about this threat, knight to e4. So lots of threats for black here to start attacking this position. The pawn on c3 is very weak, it's undefended, and there's doubled pawns on the c file. You still have your isolated a pawn, and it's just a very tough position for white. Now the engine says it's actually a 50-50 even position with correct play from white, but for a human, this is a very difficult position to play. So we have knight to f3, which is normally a good move, but again, if you put your knight on e2, then your knight on e2 is an extra defender that you have for your very weak c3 pawn. But we don't have knight to e2 to defend the c3 pawn. We have knight to f3. Now comes the queen in, and black is already +1 here according to the engine. So the queen's going after this undefended pawn, and the queen is going to try to defend the pawn, but like we talked about, attack the queen has to move, and now the pawn's going to attack the queen. So the queen is moving around because it keeps getting attacked. Meanwhile, black is improving its position on the queen side. So now the queen goes back. We have take with check. And not only is this check, but the queen is keeping an eye on this rook, which is being defended by the queen. But the king has to move. And you don't want to block with the queen, obviously, because if you try to block the check with the queen, then you're just losing your queen because the knight's covering d2. So blocking the check with the knight, which would normally be a good move, but now you have takes with the knight, and Dr. Evenman 12 actually resigned in this position, and I rook rolled you won game 2, therefore won the match. Congratulations to I rook rolled you for winning again the blue bracket for the K12 Esports League Chess Club, and what a match. Now, you might be thinking, well, why did Dr. Evelyn 12 resign in this position? And if you take a look at this position, we have taking with the knight. Now, if you take with the queen, this is actually more of an even position because we have takes, takes, takes. And with correct play from both sides, it's only favoring black by 0.8. So black is only slightly for choice here. And they still have their pawn that they won, their +1 in material. But that's not the strongest move. The strongest move is not to take with the queen. You want to take with the knight, which is what happens in the game. And the point is that you're threatening some discovered checks anytime the knight moves. So because the knight is threatening some discovered checks, you have to take the knight, and then now you're losing your rook. So now black is just +6. They're up a full rook and a pawn. And it's going to be basically impossible for white to come back in this position. And let's say, okay, well, I lost my knight and I don't want to take the knight with the queen because then I'm losing my rook. Well, only other move is the engine recommended move, which is king to e2. And then the knight's going to go back and maybe you try to push the knight out of the way. But interestingly, you're not even worried about losing that knight because if you take, then you've got pawn here. As soon as black goes pawn to e5, your bishop is being attacked. So black is going to at least win this bishop back because you have this really nasty, nasty royal pin. So you have to defend against that somehow. So maybe you defend against that nasty pin by going h3, which the engine says is a good move. But then you're losing your bishop back. And look at how black's pieces are just crushing white in the center. So then you'd have takes, and then you've got takes with check. This position's just falling apart, right? So it's just going to be really, really difficult for white to defend here. And this is still +4 in material for black and over 6 according to the engine evaluation. So there's just really no good way to defend against this position. Once you get to this position, which is the resigned position, there's just really no good way to defend. It's +4 for black and 5 in favor of black according to the engine evaluation. So really good game from both players. And Dr. Evelyn 12 is a very strong player, and I'm sure we'll see him around in the future. And we'll take a look at the next match. Let's check out game 1 between King Saki XXIV and Heston. So these two players never actually played each other before, and let's get going with this championship match. So we have a King's Opening, and we end up getting a Scotch out of the King's Opening. And this position, the knight and the pawn next to each other, that is part of the Scotch. Takes, takes, the queen and the pawn next to each other, that's also part of the Scotch. So the knight's going to develop. Bishop's going to create a pin against the knight to the queen, so you can't move your knight if you're black. And we have pawn to c5 to attack the queen right away. Takes, 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 takes. Bishop develops to c4. After all of those captures, it's an even position in terms of material and in terms of the engine evaluation. So next we have pawn to f6 because the pawn was being attacked and the pawn was undefended. And castles, the pawn's going to develop to b6. Capturing with the knight, you cannot capture with this pawn because if you capture with this pawn, then you have an isolated a pawn and you also have an isolated c pawn. And those pawns are very weak when they're isolated. So you want to keep those pawns connected on the queen side, which is what happens with the knight capturing. The bishop's going to develop to the long diagonal on b7. The rook's going to move over. A really nice pin. The pawn cannot take the bishop when the bishop develops to e6 because the nice pin, the rook is pinning the pawn against the king. So the bishop is going to develop to c6, which is a really nice move from Heston because you have to have an extra defender. Of course, there was a double attack on that d7 pawn with the bishop and the rook. So to help put an extra defender, the bishop has to help with that double attack. And now we have doubled rooks on the d file to add even more pressure. Of course, this rook has to develop to c7 because you have to have 3 defenders for this pawn since white has 3 attackers. And the rook is going to slide up to d3 to help protect the knight and takes. Now you should take with the rook because this keeps your pawn structure intact on the queen side. Now what happens in the game, and this is the best move too, but what actually happens in the game is takes. Now maybe King Saki wanted to take with the pawn because they wanted to maintain this battery. Well, the engine says, look, you got to take with the rook because you want to maintain this nice pawn structure. You want to maintain connected pawns on the queen side, and you can always move this rook from c3 back over to d3 anytime you want later on in the future, and then you have your battery again. You can always just slide the rook back over to d3. No big deal. But that's not what happens in the game. We have pawn takes, and then the rook's going to attack the undefended bishop, so the bishop has to go back. Pawn's going to attack, bishop has to go back again. That pawn was not being defended, so the rook takes, attack the rook. Now the a2 pawn's not being defended, so the a2 pawn has to be defended with another rook lift to d2, and trying to get some counterplay on the king side. It makes sense to some extent to try to get some counterplay on the king side, but the queen's off the board, and there's not, your king isn't as vulnerable as it normally would be with the queen's off the board, so it makes sense to maybe try to get some counterplay, and you also want to get this bishop back open on this diagonal again. So the rook's gonna move up to d5 to attack the bishop, and immediately down goes the bishop because Heston was saying, oh, free pawn. That pawn's not being defended. I can just take that pawn. Well, you can take the pawn, but bishop's not being defended. So there goes the bishop. Check. King has to move. Now we have a battery on the c file. Takes. Now we have an attack on the rook, reinforcing the rook on d2 by sliding the other rook over. Now you could take, king moves over, and white is still winning this position by 4 points because they still have an extra minor piece compared to Heston, who lost their minor piece. So this is still a fine position. But what happens in the game is the rook is going to slide over, takes, rook's going to go back to c6, takes with check, king has to move. You cannot put your king here because then you have a discovered check, and then the king has to move again with the discovered check. The bishop had a discovered check, takes, and now it's 3 pawns and a bishop against 3 pawns. This is a completely winning position for white because this bishop is going to help escort these pawns to the end of the board for a pawn promotion. So what happens in the game is the king does not go to c8, the king goes to e8, and then takes, check, takes. Now King Saki's winning by 5 points, and they're increasing their advantage. And check, takes. This f-pawn wants to promote to a queen. And this is a really fancy move from King Saki because the point is you actually cannot take the undefended rook because then King Saki is getting a queen. So they don't go into that line. We see check. The reason why they went to a2 is because you cannot promote right away because then you're losing your queen. So rook to f2, you're losing your queen. So the kind of a fancy move from black there. But the point is that you still can defend with the bishop, and then the rook's going to slide down to a1, and then that's checkmate. Now it's interesting because King Saki actually missed checkmate earlier. So if you take a look, this is threatening checkmate in 1, and now this is checkmate in 1. Rook to h6 is checkmate in 1. But they miss checkmate in 1 by moving bishop to e6. That's why it's saying it's a missed opportunity. And then you still end up getting checkmate after all. So King Saki wins game 1. And Heston has to win game 2 to even the series 1-1. In game 2, it's only fair for Heston to have the white pieces since King Saki had the white pieces in game 1. So we have a King's Opening and then a Scandinavian response from King Saki. And then this is also a book move, taking control of the center. Check, takes, takes, and then now you're losing a pawn. Takes. So Heston has some work to do if they're going to come back and win game 2, because they're already down by a pawn. So knight goes back. Takes. Heston has won their pawn back because that pawn on v7 was undefended. And I'm not sure the point of b8 because the knight's not being defended. And the queen takes the knight. And take again. There goes another pawn. So you won your pawn back. Then you won a minor piece. And then Heston won another pawn. So this is +4. Takes, takes. Now we're moving into the middle game because the queens are off the board. And Heston is +4. Because King Saki blundered their knight away, as well as another pawn. Takes. That bishop was not being defended. King Saki is right back in the game. So not sure why Heston is going to pawn to f4. I mean, you can just take this knight, and then the king's going to take to get this rook to a more active square, and you're still +4 here. Still +4 for Heston. So I think Heston just kind of fell asleep at the wheel a little bit because their knight on d5 was undefended, which King Saki gladly takes the undefended knight, takes, takes, and Heston is only winning by a pawn here. So the knight's going to develop. There goes the pawn on b2, takes, takes, and now it's an even position in terms of material and in terms of the engine evaluation. Castles. The knight's going to keep an eye on a2 as well as c2. There's actually a double attack on c2, so white has to respond to the double attack on c2 because the knight and the rook are working together to hit c2. So Heston responds calmly by just defending with the rook. And then the king is going to attack the undefended rook and also keep an eye on this knight, which is being defended by the pawn. But we have takes. And then I'm not sure why Heston just slid their rook over to e1. Because this is check. And the king cannot take the knight because it's being defended by the pawn. The king can't take the rook because the rook is being defended by the knight. So the king has to move. It can't capture anything. And now you're just losing another pawn. And now King Saki is back in the game, +3 here. And it's just a crazy position. And the engine says black is actually up by the equivalent of 5, not just 3, according to the engine evaluation. So kind of a awkward move there from Heston to put the rook on e1. But luckily for Heston, Saki did not see rook captures on c2 in the game. So instead what happens is takes, takes. We have an exchange of rooks. And the pawn's going to attack the pawn. And then check. The king's going to slide up to keep an eye on the pawn and the knight. Takes, takes, yikes. King Saki delivered a check, but as soon as you move your rook off of the d file, you're not defending your knight anymore. The knight lost its defender after rook to c8. And Heston gladly takes advantage of the undefended knight by capturing it, and Heston is right back in the game, +2. And that pawn was not undefended because the knight is covering behind, and knights can move backwards. There's a capture. There's another capture, and Heston has found a way to win this game and even the series 1-1, with game 3 resulting in the tiebreaker. So really nice come from behind win for Heston to come all the way back and get checkmate and win game 2 to even the series 1-1. Let's take a look at game 3. In game 3, King Saki has the white pieces, which is only fair because Heston had the white pieces in game 2. So we have a king's opening, and the bishop is going to fianchetto to b7, and then the d-pawn is going to develop to try to control the center for black, and the knight's going to develop pawn push. The knight has to move because it was being attacked. Queen's developing to h5. The other bishop develops and trying to clamp down the center and solidify this closed pawn structure, but they end up moving the bishop twice, which is violating a rule in the opening. In the opening, you normally don't want to develop the same piece twice in consecutive moves. So we have bishop to e3, and then on the very next move for white, they have bishop to g5, which violates a very important principle. You don't want to move the same piece twice in the opening, especially in back-to-back moves, 99% of the time. And that's what we see from King Saki. And the bishop's going to block because the bishop on g5 was attacking the queen, so you got to defend the queen somehow or move the queen out of the way. So they decide to take. The knight's going to develop castle queenside for black. The knight's going to hop in to b5 to go after that a7 pawn, which Heston does not see. Yikes, Heston does not see the a7 pawn being attacked because this bishop has x-ray vision through the knight on the undefended bishop. And it also comes with check. So you're taking the pawn. It looks like you're losing a knight, but it's only a temporary sacrifice. So Heston is winning by 2 points in this position, but it's just temporary because the bishop's not being defended, and now you're taking back with check. And the king has to move because there's no way to block the check. Castle kingside. And then the engine said you can just take that pawn, but King Saki's not worried about that pawn at the moment. They want to defend this weak b2 pawn. So b3 was King Saki's idea to defend the weak b2 pawn, which the queen was attacking. So this is a fancy move, and it's pretty impressive that King Saki was able to find it. The point is that if you take this pawn, you're going to take, and now there's a massive threat, rook to b1, and then you have a royal pinning the queen against the king. So Heston is extremely vulnerable in this position. Now what happens in the game is pawn to g6 to attack the queen. The queen's going to slide back since the queen was being attacked. Now we have takes, which is a transposition from the line that we had just looked at. And the knight's going to develop to b6, again, trying to stop these nasty pins that white is threatening with these rooks, with the queen and the king on the b file. Knight's going to hop in to attack this undefended pawn. The rook's going to defend. Probably would have been a little better to just slide your queen back, because even with this knight here, the engine says this queen's really vulnerable on b4. Let's just slide the queen back. It's okay to get forked, which looks really weird. This is a very bizarre engine line because you've got this really, really bizarre engine line. You're going to attack the queen has to move, and then now you can move your other rook. So at first your rooks were getting forked, but you can actually get out of the fork by attacking the queen. So now you're not actually losing a rook after all. So kind of bizarre line. None of that happens in the game. So what happens in the game is takes, going after this, let's attack the knight. So the knight has to move, but as soon as the knight moves, now you get that nasty pin that we were talking about. So the correct response for black here is to put this knight on b2 to try to block the pin. Now you're not losing your queen right away, at least. So then activate this queen. Then you're going to have the king wants to slide over this way to get out of the nasty pin. You're still going to have takes. Now this looks really weird because now white is putting themselves into a nasty pin, and the knight isn't being defended at all except for this queen. So this is a nasty pin. And then the rook wants to slide over according to the top engine move. And then a white is winning by 2 points in material, but they're actually winning by almost 6 points in reality because the queen is going to infiltrate to f6. So these are really complicated engine lines, and it makes no sense to have your queen voluntarily pinned with this rook, and you're also losing this pawn. But the point is that after queen takes, queen to e6, and then queen to c3, and then queen takes on e6, rook to g7, queen takes on d5 check. So white has finally made some progress with checking the king. And these are really complicated engine lines, but the point is that white had an opportunity to subject themselves to a nasty pin, but still come out ahead with a nice queenside attack on black's king. What ends up happening in the game is black doesn't actually find the move knight to b2 to block the nasty pin. So they sacrifice their queen, and then that's all she wrote at that point. Black lost their queen, and then there's an exchange, check. Queen moves back, exchange again, there goes a pawn, check. King slides up, taking with check. Takes, going after the rook, check. Takes, that pawn was not being defended. Takes, check. Can't take the queen because the queen's being defended by the knight. This pawn wants to promote. So to stop the pawn promotion, they had to take. That's actually a good move. You got to sacrifice your knight because the pawn was going to promote to another queen. Take with check. There goes the rook. Now black doesn't have any decent pieces left. They just have pawns left. Meanwhile, white has a full queen and a knight, and it's mate in 6 here. And eventually, white does get another queen and deliver checkmate. So King Saki wins game 3 and wins the match 2-1. And congratulations to King Saki XXIV for winning the teal bracket. And that'll do it for the K12 Esports League Championship games. I Rookrolled You wins the blue bracket, King Saki wins the teal bracket, and that is a wrap for the winter season of the K12 Esports League Chess Club. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And have a good rest of your day. Bye.